Economic, social and cultural rights are fundamental human rights that ensure people can live with dignity, equality, and security. These rights include the right to work, the right to fair wages, the right to social security, the right to health, the right to education, and the right to take part in cultural life. They are essential for the full development of individuals and communities. These rights are recognized in key international instruments, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Together, these documents affirm that all human rights are universal, indivisible, and interdependent. The enjoyment of civil and political rights is closely linked to the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights. States have the primary responsibility to respect, protect, and fulfill these rights. This includes taking steps to progressively realize them using the maximum available resources, while ensuring non-discrimination and equality. Special attention must be given to vulnerable and marginalized groups. Economic, social and cultural rights contribute to social justice, sustainable development, and lasting peace. Their effective implementation strengthens social cohesion and promotes inclusive growth. Respect for these rights is therefore not only a legal obligation but also a moral and social commitment shared by the international community. Historical and philosophical development of economic and social rights. The concept of economic and social rights has evolved over centuries, rooted in both philosophical thought and international human rights law. These rights, which include the rights to work, health, education, and an adequate standard of living, are now codified in major United Nations instruments, most notably the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, of 1966. The philosophical foundations of human rights can be traced back to early modern thinkers in Europe's Enlightenment. Philosophers such as John Locke argued that individuals possess natural rights by virtue of being human rights that precede and constrain the power of states. Locke's emphasis on freedom and equality influenced later moral and political traditions that underlie modern human rights. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract theory further developed the idea that legitimate political authority rests on the collective will of the people, implying that governments must respect fundamental human interests. Revolutionary France. In the 19th century, social and economic concerns entered the philosophical discourse as thinkers and social reformers highlighted the conditions of industrial workers and the poor. For example, the Catholic social teaching expressed in Rerum Novarum 1891 emphasized the duties of governments and employers toward laborers' welfare, reflecting early moral arguments for economic justice. The 20th century marked a major shift from theoretical debate to legal and institutional recognition. After the atrocities of World War II, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, in 1948, affirming that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and including economic and social rights as essential elements of human dignity. Building on the UDHR, the ICESCR was adopted in 1966 and entered into force in 1976, obligating states parties to progressively realize a broad range of economic, social, and cultural rights as enforceable international commitments. Philosophically, economic and social rights represent the second generation of human rights, responding to the insight that legal and civil freedoms alone cannot ensure a life of dignity without access to basic social conditions such as healthcare, education, employment, and social security. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Thinkers like John Rawls later provided modern ethical frameworks for distributive justice, arguing that equitable distribution of social and economic goods is a key component of a just society. Today, economic and social rights reflect a synthesis of historical moral thought and international law. They embody the belief that human dignity requires both freedom and the real opportunity to meet fundamental human needs, and they remain central to the ongoing development of global human rights norms. Status of economic, social, and cultural rights in international human rights law. Economic, social, and cultural rights, ESCR, occupy a central and well-established position within international human rights law. These rights are formally recognized as equal in status to civil and political rights and are considered essential for the protection of human dignity and the achievement of social justice. The international community has consistently affirmed that all human rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. The primary legal framework governing ESCR is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1966. The covenant imposes binding obligations on states parties to respect, protect, and fulfill rights such as the right to work, health, education, social security, adequate housing, food, and participation in cultural life. As of today, the ICESCR has been ratified by the majority of UN member states, reflecting broad global consensus on the importance of these rights. International human rights law recognizes the principle of progressive realization, acknowledging that the full implementation of ESCR may be achieved over time, depending on available resources. However, this principle does not permit inaction. States are required to take immediate steps, ensure non-discrimination, and guarantee minimum essential levels of each right. Certain obligations, such as equality and access without discrimination, are of immediate effect. The Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the treaty body responsible for monitoring the ICESCR, plays a key role in clarifying the content of ESCR through general comments and in reviewing state reports. The adoption of the optional protocol to the ICESCR further strengthened the legal status of these rights by enabling individuals to submit complaints at the international level. At the global and regional levels, courts, human rights mechanisms, and development institutions increasingly integrate ESCR into their work. Today, ESCR are widely recognized as legally enforceable rights and as indispensable foundations for sustainable development, peace, and inclusive societies. Nature and bearer of economic, social, and cultural rights. Economic, social, and cultural rights, ESCR, are fundamental human rights that aim to ensure the dignity, well-being, and full development of every individual. In international human rights law, these rights are understood as legal entitlements that require positive action by states and collective responsibility by the international community. Their nature reflects the understanding that human dignity cannot be achieved without access to basic social and economic conditions. The nature of ESCR is both normative and practical. Normatively, they are legally recognized rights affirmed in international instruments such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Practically, they require states to adopt laws, policies, and programs to create conditions in which individuals can effectively enjoy these rights. ESCR are characterized by the principle of progressive realization, which acknowledges differing levels of national resources while requiring continuous and deliberate efforts toward full implementation. At the same time, core obligations, including non-discrimination and minimum essential levels of rights, are of immediate effect. ESCR are also collective in impact but individual in entitlement. While their realization often depends on broad social and economic systems, each person holds these rights individually. This reflects the UN position that all human rights belong to individuals by virtue of their humanity, without distinction of any kind. The primary bearers of ESCR are all human beings, regardless of nationality, gender, social status, or economic condition. Every person is entitled to enjoy these rights equally. Special consideration is given to vulnerable and marginalized groups, whose access to ESCR may be limited by structural inequalities. States are the principal duty bearers. They are obligated to respect, protect, and fulfill ESCR within their jurisdiction. In an increasingly interconnected world, international cooperation also plays an important role in supporting the realization of these rights globally. Together, this framework affirms that ESCR are universal rights essential to human dignity, social justice, and sustainable development. International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, is one of the core international human rights treaties adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1966. Together with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it forms the International Bill of Human Rights. The ICESCR provides a comprehensive legal framework for the protection and promotion of economic, social, and cultural rights at the global level. The Covenant recognizes a wide range of rights, including the right to work, just and favorable conditions of work, social security, an adequate standard of living, health, education, and participation in cultural life. States parties commit themselves to take steps, individually and through international assistance and cooperation, to progressively realize these rights using the maximum of their available resources. The Covenant emphasizes equality, non-discrimination, and human dignity as guiding principles. The Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, CESCR, is the body responsible for monitoring the implementation of the ICESCR. Established by the UN Economic and Social Council, the committee is composed of independent experts with recognized competence in human rights. Its mandate is to assess how states parties are fulfilling their obligations under the Covenant. One of the committee's key functions is the examination of periodic reports submitted by states. Through constructive dialogue, the committee identifies progress, challenges, and areas requiring improvement. The committee also issues general comments, which provide authoritative interpretations of the Covenant's provisions and clarify the nature and scope of states' obligations. These general comments have become important references for governments, courts, and civil society worldwide. With the adoption of the optional protocol to the ICESCR, the committee gained the authority to consider individual communications and inquiries, further strengthening the enforceability of economic, social, and cultural rights. Together, the ICESCR and the CESCR play a vital role in advancing social justice, accountability, and respect for human dignity across the international community. Right to food. The right to food is a fundamental human right firmly rooted in the framework of economic, social, and cultural rights, ESCR. It is recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and legally protected under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This right affirms that every person has the entitlement to adequate, safe, and nutritious food necessary for a life of dignity. In the UN understanding, the right to food is not limited to the availability of food alone. It also includes accessibility, adequacy, and sustainability. Food must be physically and economically accessible to all, without discrimination. It must meet dietary needs, respect cultural traditions, and be safe for consumption. Sustainability ensures that future generations are not deprived of this right. States are the primary duty bearers of the right to food. They are obligated to respect existing access to food, protect individuals from interference by third parties, and fulfill the right by facilitating and, when necessary, providing food. Special attention is required for vulnerable and marginalized groups, including children, older persons, persons with disabilities, and those affected by poverty or conflict. At the international level, cooperation plays an important role in addressing global challenges such as hunger, food insecurity, climate change, and unequal food systems. The realization of the right to food is essential for human dignity, health, social stability, and sustainable development, and remains a shared responsibility of the global community. Right to housing. The right to housing is a core component of economic, social, and cultural rights, ESCR, enshrined in Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, which recognizes the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living. In the United Nations framework, housing is understood not merely as shelter, but as a condition for living in security, peace, and dignity. According to UN human rights standards, adequate housing comprises several essential elements, including legal security of tenure, availability of basic services, affordability, habitability, accessibility, appropriate location, and cultural adequacy. The enjoyment of this right must be ensured without discrimination, with particular attention to vulnerable and marginalized groups such as women, children, persons with disabilities, migrants, and those living in poverty. States parties are obligated to pursue the progressive realization of the right to housing by utilizing the maximum of available resources and adopting appropriate legislative, administrative, and policy measures. Forced evictions are considered a prima facie violation of this right unless strictly justified, procedurally safeguarded, and accompanied by adequate alternative housing and remedies. Ultimately, the right to housing is fundamental to human dignity, social inclusion, and sustainable development, contributing directly to the achievement of SDG 11 on inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable cities. Right to health from an ESCR perspective. The right to health is a fundamental component of economic, social, and cultural rights, ESCR, firmly articulated in Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR. It recognizes the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, grounded in human dignity and social justice. Within the United Nations human rights framework, the right to health does not imply a right to be healthy, but rather a right to a system of health protection that provides availability, accessibility, acceptability, and quality, AAQ, of health facilities, goods, and services. This includes access to essential medicines, safe water and sanitation, adequate nutrition, healthy working and environmental conditions, and accurate health-related information. States bear the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill this right through progressive realization, utilizing the maximum of available resources. Immediate obligations include non-discrimination, equal access to health services, and the adoption of deliberate and targeted measures. Particular attention must be given to vulnerable and marginalized groups, including women, children, older persons, persons with disabilities, and those living in poverty. The right to health is closely linked with other human rights and is indispensable for sustainable development. Its effective implementation is essential for achieving universal health coverage and advancing the objectives of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, notably SDG 3. Right to education from an ESCR perspective. The right to education constitutes a cornerstone of economic, social, and cultural rights, ESCR, and is explicitly recognized under Articles 13 and 14 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR. Education is both a human right in itself and an indispensable means of realizing other human rights, democratic governance, and sustainable development. In the United Nations normative framework, the right to education is guided by the four interrelated dimensions of availability, accessibility, acceptability, and adaptability, the 4As. Primary education must be compulsory and free for all, while secondary and higher education should be made progressively accessible on the basis of capacity, particularly through the introduction of free education. Education systems must be inclusive, non-discriminatory, culturally appropriate, and of good quality. States parties are obliged to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to education through progressive realization, employing the maximum of available resources. However, certain obligations are of immediate effect, notably the prohibition of discrimination and the duty to adopt concrete and targeted measures. Special attention is required for marginalized and vulnerable groups, including girls, children with disabilities, migrants, and those affected by poverty or conflict. Ultimately, the effective realization of the right to education is central to human dignity, social mobility, and the attainment of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, particularly SDG 4 on inclusive and equitable quality education. Other economic, social, and cultural (ESC) rights. Beyond the core rights to housing, health, and education, economic, social, and cultural rights (ESCR) encompass a broad spectrum of interrelated entitlements that are essential for human dignity and the realization of a life in freedom and security. These include, inter alia, the right to work in just and favorable conditions of employment, the right to social security, the right to an adequate standard of living, including food, clothing, and housing, and the right to participate in cultural life. As articulated in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, these rights are indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated, forming a normative framework that obliges states parties to respect, protect, and fulfill them progressively, using the maximum of available resources. The United Nations Committee on ESCR underscores that these rights must be realized without discrimination, with particular attention to vulnerable and marginalized populations, including women, children, indigenous peoples, migrants, and persons with disabilities. Implementation requires comprehensive legal, policy, and institutional measures, including social protection programs, labor regulations, access to basic services, and safeguards for cultural participation. States must also ensure remedies and accountability mechanisms for violations. In sum, the ensemble of ESC rights is fundamental for achieving social justice, equality, and sustainable development, directly supporting the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly SDG 1, No Poverty, SDG 2, Zero Hunger, and SDG 8, Decent Work and Economic Growth. Economic and social rights in regional human rights instruments. Regional human rights instruments play a crucial role in the protection and promotion of economic and social rights, ESCR, alongside universal treaties like the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR. These instruments embed socio-economic rights within regional legal frameworks, reinforcing states' obligations to respect, protect and fulfill rights such as work, health, education, social security and adequate living conditions through tailored mechanisms informed by local historical, cultural and political contexts. In Africa, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights recognizes a broad spectrum of ESCR, including the right to work, health and education, and emphasizes collective people's rights such as the right to economic and social development. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights monitors implementation and interprets these provisions, contributing to normative development across the continent. In the Americas, the American Convention on Human Rights coupled with the additional protocol in the area of economic, social and cultural rights, Protocol of San Salvador, establishes enforceable socioeconomic guarantees. The protocol obliges states to progressively realize ESCR including social security, health, just employment conditions and trade union rights, subject to monitoring by the Inter-American Human Rights System. The European Social Charter of the Council of Europe is one of the most comprehensive regional instruments dedicated explicitly to ESCR. It obliges states to secure a wide range of social rights from employment and housing to health and education and is subject to review by the European Committee of Social Rights. Other regional frameworks, including ASEAN human rights declarations, also increasingly reference socioeconomic standards, reflecting a global trend to affirm ESCR as indispensable to human dignity, equality and sustainable development within diverse legal traditions. Social protection and human rights regional instruments thus complement universal law, enhance accountability, and support the progressive realization of ESCR within specific legal and cultural contexts. An African Charter on Human and People's Rights. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights, Banjul Charter, is a foundational regional human rights treaty of the African Union, adopted in 1981 and in force since 1986. It uniquely integrates economic, social and cultural rights, ESCR, with civil and political rights and collective people's rights, including the right to economic and social development. While the Charter does not mirror the ICESCR's progressive realization framework verbatim, it explicitly recognizes the right to work under equitable and satisfactory conditions, Article 15, right to health, Article 16, and right to education, Article 17, reflecting broad ESCR commitments. Moreover, Articles 21 to 22 affirm collective people's rights to freely dispose of wealth and natural resources and to pursue economic, social, and cultural development in accordance with their identity, laying normative ground for social justice and developmental self-determination. States parties are obliged to eliminate discrimination and take all necessary measures, individually and through cooperation, to ensure the effective enjoyment of these rights, with equal attention to vulnerable groups such as women, children, the aged and disabled. The Charter's quasi-judicial mechanisms, including the African Commission, monitor implementation and interpret ESCR obligations as integral to human dignity and sustainable development, underscoring their indivisibility with civil and political rights. The American Convention on Human Rights and Protocol of San Salvador. The American Convention on Human Rights, Pact of San Jose, initially provides limited explicit ESCR protection within its main text, focusing primarily on civil and political rights. Recognizing this gap, states parties adopted the additional protocol in the area of economic, social, and cultural rights, the Protocol of San Salvador, 1988, to strengthen regional ESCR norms. Under this protocol, states commit to protect and progressively realize a range of socioeconomic rights, such as the right to work, right to health, right to food, right to education, and rights of families and children. It emphasizes accessibility, non-discrimination, and states' obligations to adopt legislative, administrative, and policy measures to ensure effective implementation. The protocol also recognizes the right to a healthy environment and access to basic public services, representing an expanded ESCR framework that aligns with evolving human rights expectations. Although implementation depends on ratification and domestic incorporation, the Protocol of San Salvador reflects a regional commitment to embed economic and social rights within binding human rights law, reinforcing the broader interdependence and indivisibility of all human rights. Its monitoring mechanisms, through the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, provide oversight and review of state compliance, advancing accountability and normative development in the Americas. See ASEAN Declaration on the Basic Duties of Peoples and Governments. The Declaration of the Basic Duties of ASEAN Peoples and Governments articulates normative principles promoting human rights and duties within the Southeast Asian context. While not a binding human rights treaty, it underscores the duty of governments to ensure and protect basic rights, including a decent standard of living, security, dignity, and social development, and calls for incorporation of international human rights standards into national constitutions. It links these duties to respect for socioeconomic entitlements such as decent living conditions and socioeconomic development, reflecting a regional effort to embrace elements of ESCR alongside civil and political rights. Through its emphasis on duties, it frames ESCR as reciprocal obligations of citizens and states, reinforcing ASEAN member states' commitments to human rights recognized in global frameworks. Although not as legally enforceable as other regional instruments, the declaration influences domestic legal reform and human rights promotion by encouraging ratification of the international covenants and integration of economic, social, and cultural considerations in governance. D. Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States. The Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1974 to promote an equitable global economic order. It asserts state sovereign rights to pursue economic policies for national development and social welfare, including the right to regulate natural resources, determine development paths, and engage in international economic cooperation. It also emphasizes corresponding duties to contribute to global economic justice, respect other states' sovereignty, and foster international cooperation to reduce disparities. Though not a human rights treaty in the strict sense, its principles underpin broader ESCR by recognizing that equitable economic structures and international cooperation are essential for realizing socioeconomic opportunities and human dignity. The Charter informs human rights discourse by situating economic rights within the responsibilities of states to uphold conditions conducive to social and cultural well-being, thereby enriching the normative context for ESCR at national and international levels. E. European Social Charter. The European Social Charter, adopted by the Council of Europe, is a comprehensive regional treaty dedicated to guaranteeing economic and social rights as a complement to civil and political rights protected under the European Convention on Human Rights. It obliges states parties to uphold a wide array of rights related to employment, social security, housing, health, education, fair remuneration, safe working conditions, social welfare, and protection from poverty, emphasizing practical and enforceable socioeconomic guarantees. States must report regularly on implementation and may be held accountable through the European Committee of Social Rights. The Charter's detailed provisions on workplace rights, social protection, and access to essential services embody the indivisibility of human rights, directly fostering social inclusion and equality for vulnerable groups such as children, persons with disabilities, and migrant workers. It functions as a social constitution of Europe, shaping domestic policies and jurisprudence, and inspiring the integration of ESCR within European Union law. Economic, social, and cultural rights and non-state actors. Economic, social, and cultural rights, ESCR, are internationally recognized entitlements that enable every individual to enjoy an adequate standard of living, health, education, work, social security, and cultural participation. These rights are codified in instruments such as the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, which imposes obligations on states to respect, protect, and fulfill these rights progressively and without discrimination. However, in practice, non-state actors including transnational corporations, private enterprises, civil society organizations, armed groups, and even international financial institutions exercise tremendous influence on the realization of ESCR around the world. Although international human rights treaties bind states, not private entities directly, states are required to protect individuals from rights violations by non-state actors through effective regulation, oversight, and remedies. This means adopting laws, policies, and enforcement mechanisms to prevent corporations and other powerful actors from undermining ESCR, such as by degrading workplace protections, restricting access to essential services, or displacing communities without adequate housing or compensation. Increasingly, human rights bodies and scholars argue that non-state actors themselves bear responsibilities to avoid infringing human rights and to actively support their realization. This includes aligning business practices, investment decisions, and operational policies with human rights norms and engaging in cooperative strategies that strengthen social justice and equitable development. Civil society and human rights defenders also play a vital role, documenting impacts, advocating for accountability, and empowering communities to claim their ESCR, often in the face of resistance from powerful non-state interests. At multinational companies and economic, social, and cultural. Multinational companies, MNCs, are powerful economic actors whose global operations can significantly affect the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights, ESCR, including rights to work, decent conditions, health, education, and an adequate standard of living. Although binding human rights treaties like the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, primarily impose obligations on states, the United Nations Human Rights Framework increasingly recognizes that non-state actors, particularly MNCs, have responsibilities to respect internationally recognized human rights within their spheres of influence. This reflects evolving international norms on business and human rights. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, UNGPs, unanimously endorsed by the Human Rights Council, establish a global standard: states must protect against corporate harms, and businesses have an independent corporate responsibility to respect human rights, including implementing due diligence to identify, prevent, and address rights impacts. This responsibility extends to labor rights, non-discrimination, safe working environments, and fair remuneration that supports an adequate standard of living. International frameworks such as the UN norms on the responsibilities of transnational corporations and the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises further articulate expectations that MNCs should avoid contributing to human rights abuses and proactively promote human rights. They encourage companies to integrate human rights considerations into policies, supply chains, and stakeholder engagement, and to provide effective remedy mechanisms when harm occurs. In sum, while states remain the primary duty bearers for ESCR, MNCs are expected to uphold human rights standards, respect labor and socio-economic rights, and contribute to sustainable development, thereby reinforcing global human rights protections within market-driven contexts. B. Human Rights Organization. Human rights organizations play a central role in the promotion, protection, and realization of economic, social, and cultural rights, ESCR, at global, regional, and national levels. They monitor states' compliance with international human rights treaties such as the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, mobilize public awareness, conduct research, engage in advocacy and support litigation and policy reform aimed at ending discrimination, poverty, and inequality. ESCR encompass essential entitlements such as adequate housing, health, work, education, and social security, which human rights organizations place at the heart of their efforts to uphold human dignity and social justice. One key network, ESCRnet, International Network for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, connects over 280 civil society groups in grassroots movements across more than 75 countries to defend and advance socioeconomic rights through collective action, information exchange, and strategic campaigns. By uniting diverse actors, ESCRnet amplifies voices demanding right-centered economic policies and accountability for violations. Specialized organizations such as the Global Initiative for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, GISCR, focus on structural change by shaping narratives, supporting communities, and influencing international policy debates to make ESCR a reference point for governance and public services. They build evidence, partnerships, and advocacy platforms that foreground social and economic justice globally. Mainstream human rights organizations like Amnesty International integrate ESCR into their broader work, campaigning against poverty, unsafe working conditions, education inequity, and lack of access to water and health services, while urging states to fulfill their human rights obligations. Together, human rights organizations enhance accountability, empower marginalized communities to claim their rights, and contribute to the realization of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, particularly goals on no poverty, quality education, health, and decent work. 5. Justiciability of ESC rights and the role of courts. The justiciability of economic, social, and cultural rights, ESCR, refers to the capacity of individuals and groups to seek and obtain remedies through independent, impartial, and effective judicial or quasi-judicial bodies when their socio-economic rights such as rights to health, education, work, housing, and social security are violated or threatened. Rather than being abstract policy goals, ESCR must be accompanied by access to legal remedies that ensure states meet their obligations under instruments like the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR. Contrary to outdated assumptions that ESCR are non-justiciable because they are progressive or resource-dependent, international legal practice demonstrates that courts around the world have adjudicated ESCR claims. National constitutions in many countries explicitly protect socio-economic rights, and domestic courts in Argentina, South Africa, Canada, the Philippines, and Europe have delivered judgments enforcing ESCR entitlements, often interpreting public policy and budgetary action in light of human rights obligations. Regional human rights mechanisms, such as the European Committee of Social Rights, further contribute to jurisprudence on ESCR enforcement. The UN Committee on ESCR emphasizes that effective remedies including access to courts, reparations, injunctions, and institutional reforms are essential components of human rights protection. Judicial review promotes accountability and strengthens the rule of law by compelling states to justify actions that impact socio-economic rights and to take corrective measures when violations are found. As jurisprudence evolves, the role of courts remains indispensable in translating normative commitments into lived protections for all people. Importance of judicial interpretation of economic, social, and cultural rights. Judicial interpretation of economic, social, and cultural rights, ESCR, plays a pivotal role in transforming abstract legal norms into effective, enforceable entitlements that uphold human dignity and social justice. While treaties such as the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, establish states' obligations to progressively realize socio-economic rights, courts and judicial bodies are essential in clarifying the scope, content, and legal force of these obligations when disputes arise. Judicial interpretation helps define rights like adequate housing, health, education, work, and social security in concrete terms that resonate with local realities and legal frameworks, ensuring norms are not merely rhetorical. Courts contribute to accountability by reviewing state action and omissions, assessing whether public policies and resource allocations are consistent with human rights obligations, and ordering remedies or structural changes where violations occur. Global case law databases illustrate how progressive jurisprudence on ESCR has emerged across jurisdictions, reinforcing that socio-economic rights are justiciable and not less worthy of protection than civil and political rights. Judicial interpretation also refines the meaning of key concepts and clarifies states' duties regarding non-discrimination, minimum core obligations, and progressive realization. By weaving international standards into domestic law, judiciaries help concretize the indivisibility of human rights, strengthen rule of law, and empower individuals and communities to claim their rights effectively. Thus, courts are indispensable partners in realizing the transformative promise of ESCR worldwide. Forms of special remedies in cases of violation of economic, social, and cultural rights. When economic, social, and cultural rights, ESCR, are violated, such as rights to adequate housing, health, work, education, or social security, states must not only acknowledge the breach but also ensure effective and enforceable remedies so victims obtain justice. Under international human rights law, an effective remedy requires access to independent and impartial procedures, timely relief, and concrete outcomes that redress harm and prevent recurrence. 1. Declaratory remedies. Courts or human rights bodies may issue declarations of rights and violations, affirming that the state's conduct failed to meet its ESCR obligations. Such declarations clarify legal entitlements and guide future state action, reinforcing normative standards. 2. Injunctions and structural orders. Judges can issue injunctive relief or structural interdicts orders compelling the state to take specific actions, e.g., provide housing programs, ensure access to health services, or to refrain from conduct that harms ESCR enjoyment. These remedies are crucial where simple compensation is insufficient to guarantee rights. 3. Compensation and reparation. Individuals who suffered harm may be entitled to financial or non-financial compensation, including restitution of lost benefits, rehabilitation services, and guarantees of non-repetition. Reparations help restore dignity and address concrete socio-economic loss. For access to information and legal aid, states must ensure access to justice by removing barriers, regulatory, social, or economic, that hinder victims from seeking remedies. Effective legal aid, transparent procedures, and information are essential to empowering claimants. Collectively, these remedies, from declaratory orders and injunctions to compensation and structural reform, operationalize ESCR protection, translating state obligations into tangible relief and reinforcing accountability within domestic and regional human rights systems. B. Forms of special remedies in cases of violations of ESC rights. Violations of economic, social, and cultural rights, ESCR, encompassing rights to housing, health, education, work, social security, and an adequate standard of living, require effective, accessible, and enforceable remedies to restore rights and ensure accountability. The United Nations and regional human rights bodies emphasize that remedies for ESCR violations must go beyond symbolic recognition and deliver practical relief, reflecting the indivisibility of human rights. 1. Declaratory relief. Courts or human rights bodies may issue declarations affirming the violation of ESCR, establishing legal recognition of rights breaches and guiding states in compliance and policy reform. 2. Injunctions and structural orders. Courts may mandate states to take specific positive actions, such as providing social services, housing, or health interventions, or to cease policies that undermine ESCR. Structural remedies often require continuous monitoring to ensure compliance. 3. Compensation and reparation. Victims of ESCR violations may receive financial compensation, restitution, rehabilitation, or guarantees of non-repetition, addressing tangible losses and reinforcing human dignity. For access to justice measures, effective remedies require legal aid, information dissemination, and removal of procedural barriers, enabling affected individuals and communities to claim their rights. In combination, these special remedies operationalize ESCR protection by ensuring accountability, preventing recurrence, and translating legal obligations into tangible socio-economic outcomes, thereby reinforcing the universality and enforceability of economic, social, and cultural rights globally. C. Concept, methodology, and important strategic litigation for the implementation of ESC rights. Strategic litigation is a purpose-driven legal approach that goes beyond securing remedies for individual plaintiffs to effect broader systemic change in law, policy, and public practice. Its core concept lies in identifying cases with potential to clarify rights and enforce state obligations under human rights law, particularly the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, and its optional protocol, ICESCR. The ICESCR permits individuals and groups to bring complaints before the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, strengthening the justiciability of ESC rights at the international level. The methodology of strategic litigation involves careful case selection, rigorous legal research and evidence building, framing claims to highlight structural violations, and combining litigation with complementary advocacy and public mobilization to amplify impact. Cases are pursued not simply for individual relief but to secure precedents, clarify normative content, and catalyze legislative and policy reforms. The importance of strategic litigation for ESC rights lies in its power to hold states accountable, address gaps in implementation, and influence global and national jurisprudence. It advances social justice, strengthens the rule of law, and provides practical mechanisms for marginalized communities to claim economic, social, and cultural entitlements as enforceable rights rather than discretionary policy goals. D. Fundamental rights under the construction. Fundamental rights under a constitution represent legally guaranteed entitlements essential for human dignity, equality, and social justice. From the perspective of economic, social, and cultural rights, ESCR, these rights align closely with international human rights standards developed under the United Nations system, particularly the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, 1966. ESCR include the right to education, health, adequate food, housing, work, social security, and participation in cultural life. Modern constitutions, including those of many UN member states, increasingly recognize these rights as justiciable fundamental rights, reflecting the UN's rights-based approach to development. The Constitution obliges the state to respect, protect, and fulfill ESCR through appropriate legislative, administrative, and budgetary measures. In UN practice, ESCR are guided by key principles such as non-discrimination, equality, progressive realization, maximum available resources, participation, transparency, and accountability. While full realization may be progressive, the state has immediate obligations, including ensuring minimum core content and prohibiting discrimination. From an ESCR perspective, fundamental rights are not merely policy goals but binding constitutional and human rights commitments. Effective enforcement through courts, independent institutions, and social policy strengthens human dignity, reduces inequality, and promotes inclusive and sustainable development, consistent with UN human rights norms and the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. D. Defective principles and state policies under the Constitution. Defective principles and state policies under a constitution refer to non-justiciable constitutional directives that guide the state in governance and lawmaking. From an economic, social, and cultural rights (ESCR) perspective, these principles reflect the constitutional commitment to achieving social justice, welfare, and equitable development, consistent with United Nations human rights instruments such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, 1948, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, 1966, and related ILO and UNESCO standards. In UN human rights practice, ESCR obligations require states to adopt appropriate policies, plans, and programs to progressively realize rights such as health, education, housing, food, employment, and social security. Defective principles serve as constitutional policy frameworks that translate international ESCR norms into domestic governance. Although not directly enforceable by courts, they impose a moral, political, and international obligation on the state. The UN emphasizes principles of progressive realization, use of maximum available resources, non-discrimination, participation, and accountability in the formulation of state policies. Failure to align policies with these principles may result in structural inequality and social exclusion. Thus, from an ESCR perspective, defective principles and state policies function as essential tools for implementing constitutional values in UN human rights commitments, bridging the gap between legal rights and practical realization for inclusive and sustainable development. F. Selected case studies. I. Olga Tellis vs. Bombay Municipal Cooperation, India. Olga Tellis vs. Bombay Municipal Corporation is a landmark decision that significantly advanced economic, social, and cultural rights (ESCR) jurisprudence through constitutional interpretation. The Supreme Court of India held that the right to livelihood is an integral part of the right to life, thereby extending constitutional protection to socio-economic entitlements of urban poor and pavement dwellers. From a UN ESCR perspective, the judgment closely aligns with international human rights instruments such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Articles 6 and 11, which recognize the rights to work, adequate housing, and an adequate standard of living. The court emphasized that eviction without rehabilitation would deprive individuals of their livelihood, leading to a violation of human dignity. The decision reflects core UN ESCR principles including human dignity, non-discrimination, proportionality, and state obligation to protect vulnerable groups. While the court acknowledged the authority of the state to regulate public spaces, it required that such actions comply with fair procedure and humane treatment, echoing UN standards on forced evictions. Thus, Olga Tellis transformed civil and political rights into a vehicle for ESCR protection, demonstrating how constitutional courts can domesticate global human rights norms and promote social justice consistent with UN human rights philosophy. 2. Subramani B.S. Minister of Health, South Africa. Subramani vs. Minister of Health, KwaZulu-Natal, is a leading constitutional case on economic, social and cultural rights, ESCR, particularly the right to health, resource allocation, and state obligations. The applicant, suffering from chronic renal failure, claimed that denial of life-saving dialysis treatment in a public hospital violated his constitutional right to healthcare and life. From a UN ESCR perspective, the case reflects the application of principles contained in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, Article 12, and General Comment No. 14 of the UN Committee on ESCR. The South African Constitutional Court held that the state's obligation to realize ESCR is subject to available resources and reasonable policy measures. The court accepted that prioritization criteria used by the hospital were rational and non-discriminatory. The judgment strongly emphasized the UN principle of progressive realization, recognizing that states cannot immediately provide all socio-economic services to everyone. However, it also highlighted the importance of fair, transparent, and accountable decision-making in health policy. While criticized for limited individual relief, the case remains significant in global ESCR jurisprudence as it clarifies the balance between human dignity and resource constraints. It demonstrates judicial deference to policy choices while reinforcing the state's duty to act consistently with constitutional values and international human rights norms. Nepalese judicial stand and case studies. The Nepalese judiciary has played a progressive and transformative role in advancing economic, social, and cultural rights, ESCR, through constitutional interpretation and public interest litigation. Drawing inspiration from global human rights instruments such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, 1966, and UN General Comments, the Supreme Court of Nepal has increasingly treated ESCR as enforceable constitutional rights rather than mere policy objectives. Key judicial trends include recognition of the right to health, education, food, clean environment, housing, and social security as integral to the right to life and human dignity. In cases related to environmental protection, health services, and food security, the court has applied UN principles of non-discrimination, proportionality, reasonableness, and state accountability. It has also emphasized the state's duty to adopt affirmative measures for marginalized and vulnerable groups. Consistent with UN ESCR doctrine, Nepali courts acknowledge progressive realization and resource constraints, while still enforcing minimum core obligations and procedural fairness. Judicial directives often require policy reform, legislative action, or administrative compliance, reflecting a rights-based governance approach. Overall, the Nepalese judicial stand demonstrates alignment with global ESCR jurisprudence, using constitutional remedies to bridge international human rights commitments with domestic implementation and promote inclusive, equitable, and sustainable development. Landmark ESCR-related decisions of the Supreme Court of Nepal. Prakash Mani Sharma v. Government of Nepal, Environment and Health case. The court recognized the right to clean and healthy environment as part of the right to life and human dignity. It aligned environmental protection with ESCR and UN Sustainable Development Principles. Mira Dungana v. Government of Nepal, Gender Equality case. This case strengthened women's economic and social rights by promoting equality in property and employment laws. The court relied on CEDAW and ICESCR principles to remove structural discrimination. Advocate Om Prakash Ariel v. Council of Ministers, Right to Health case. The Supreme Court affirmed that access to basic health services is a constitutional obligation of the state. It emphasized minimum core obligations under the right to health. Yogi Narahari Nath v. Prime Minister, Food Sovereignty case. The court linked food security and food sovereignty with ESCR and the right to life. It directed the state to adopt policies ensuring adequate food availability and access. Shanta Basnet v. Government of Nepal, Education and Child Rights case. This case reinforced the right to education and child welfare as enforceable socio-economic rights. The court reflected UNCRC and ICESCR standards in its reasoning. Role of NHRIs in enforceability of economic, social, and cultural rights. National human rights institutions, NHRIs, play a crucial role in strengthening the enforceability of economic, social, and cultural rights, ESCR, at the national level. In line with the Paris Principles, 1993, NHRIs are mandated to promote and protect all human rights, including ESCR, through independent monitoring, advisory functions, and complaint handling mechanisms. Their work complements judicial enforcement and bridges gaps between international obligations and domestic implementation. From a UN ESCR perspective, NHRIs contribute to accountability, accessibility, and participation. They monitor state compliance with international instruments such as the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, 1966, and use UN general comments to interpret rights relating to health, education, housing, work, and social security. Through investigations, public inquiries, and recommendations, NHRIs address systemic violations affecting marginalized and vulnerable groups. NHRIs also play an important role in policy review and legislative reform, ensuring that state laws and development plans comply with ESCR standards of non-discrimination, progressive realization, and use of maximum available resources. By engaging with UN treaty bodies, submitting parallel reports, and raising public awareness, NHRIs enhance international and domestic pressure for compliance. Thus, within the UN human rights framework, NHRIs act as key institutional mechanisms for translating ESCR from normative commitments into practical and enforceable rights. Other thematic issues and their connection to ESC rights. Economic, social, and cultural rights, ESCR, are closely interconnected with several cross-cutting thematic issues recognized in the United Nations Human Rights Framework. Themes such as gender equality, climate change, poverty, migration, disability, indigenous peoples' rights, and digital inclusion directly affect the realization of ESCR worldwide. UN instruments including the UDHR, ICESCR, CEDAW, CRPD, CRC, and UNDRIP emphasize that ESCR must be implemented in an integrated and non-discriminatory manner. From an ESCR perspective, poverty and inequality undermine access to health, education, housing, food, and social security, requiring states to adopt rights-based development policies. Climate change and environmental degradation impact the rights to health, food, water, and livelihood, as recognized by UN Human Rights Council resolutions. Gender and social inclusion are essential, as women, children, persons with disabilities, migrants, and minorities often face structural barriers to ESCR enjoyment. UN standards stress principles of non-discrimination, participation, accountability, and progressive realization in addressing these thematic issues. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development integrates ESCR across all Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, reinforcing their indivisibility with other human rights. Thus, other thematic issues are not separate from ESCR but are deeply interconnected, requiring holistic, inclusive, and rights-based state action consistent with UN human rights obligations. Right to development. The right to development is a collective and individual human right that places the human person at the center of development processes. It was formally recognized in the UN Declaration on the Right to Development, 1986, and is closely linked with economic, social and cultural rights, ESCR, as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, 1966. From an ESCR perspective, the right to development requires states to create conditions in which all people can enjoy rights related to health, education, food, housing, work, social security, and cultural participation. Development is not limited to economic growth, it must ensure equitable distribution of benefits, social justice, and human dignity. UN documents emphasize that development policies must be people-centered, participatory, inclusive, and sustainable. Core principles of the right to development include equality, non-discrimination, participation, transparency, accountability, and international cooperation. States have the primary responsibility to formulate development strategies that use maximum available resources for the progressive realization of ESCR, while fulfilling minimum core obligations. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development further operationalizes this right by integrating human rights norms into global development goals. Thus, the right to development serves as a normative bridge between ESCR and global development policy, reinforcing development as a legally grounded human rights entitlement rather than a discretionary policy choice. Labor law and right to work, including right at work. Labor law is a core legal framework for the realization of the right to work and rights at work, which are central components of economic, social, and cultural rights, ESCR. The right to work is recognized under Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Articles 6 and 7 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, 1966. It encompasses the opportunity to gain a living by freely chosen or accepted work in conditions of dignity, equality, and safety. From a UN ESCR perspective, the right to work includes both access to employment and rights at work, such as just and favorable conditions of work, fair wages, equal pay for work of equal value, safe and healthy working conditions, reasonable working hours, rest, and social security. International Labour Organization, ILO, instruments, particularly the core labor standards on freedom of association, collective bargaining, elimination of forced labor, abolition of child labor, and non-discrimination, are integral to ESCR implementation. States have obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill labor rights through legislation, labor inspection, social dialogue, and effective remedies. UN standards emphasize non-discrimination, progressive realization, and protection of vulnerable workers, including women, migrants, informal workers, and persons with disabilities. Thus, labor law operationalizes ESCR by transforming the right to work into enforceable legal entitlements, promoting decent work, social justice, and inclusive development consistent with UN human rights norms. Remarks. United Nations 1966, International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. https://www.okhr.org/n/instruments/mechanisms/instruments/International Covenant Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. United Nations 1986, Declaration on the Right to Development. https://www.okhr.org/n/instruments/mechanisms/instruments/Declaration Right Development. United Nations. 1948, Universal Declaration of Human